start with one of the very interesting concepts you have talked about is that the role of a CFO in a company is like that of the Pandavas in Mahabharata. Can you elaborate on that for our viewers?
So I've said in one of my talks that it's like Yudhishthir, the CFO has to be known for his or her integrity, should never be dishonest, and by friends and foes alike respected for his honesty. He can, of course, be sometimes occasionally economical with the truth, but you can never stick to anything other than the facts. The CFO is always a bit like Bhima, who wields enormous power as the second of the Pandavas. That's because the CFO has control over cash and cash flows, allocates resources, handles compliances, and controls for the organization, all of which puts him or her in a position of power. Then the third Pandava is Arjuna. Just as Arjun was known for being focused on the eye of the fish, the CFO keeps the organization focused on value creation without really getting distracted over the long run. The fourth and the fifth Pandavas were Nakula and Sahadeva. We don't know too much about them, but they were gifted swordsmen. But at the same time, they were very content to stay away from the limelight and let the light shine on the others, including the three elder brothers. Truly, similarly, the CFO is sometimes should be okay with letting limelight share on the others. And of course, there's Draupadi. Like Draupadi, I think the CFO should be comfortable partnering with the different business partners and not really letting any of them know who's his or her favorite. So that was my analogy to the Pandavas.
I'll talk about one more concept that you have mentioned in the book, the 10-minute fly on the wall test for being a good finance partner to the business. Can you share about that, please?
Yeah, the CFO, or for that matter, any finance partner, should be intimate with his or her business and be equally familiar with financial concepts as well as business concepts and the business model. So I imagine this coming through as a fly in the wall test. So imagine a finance partner meeting with a business leader in a corridor in the office. Both of them have a conversation for about 10 minutes. And then there is a fly on the wall listening in into the conversation. So during this conversation, one of the persons of finance, both the people will talk equally about business. They will also talk about finance. And the test is at the end of it, the fly on the wall should not be able to make out who's finance among them and who's business among them, which basically means that the finance person is so well connected with the business that he or she talks about business details. And equally, because the finance person has worked with the business leader over a period of time, the business person is able to internalize finance metrics into a business conversation. And when he or she speaks about the business, finance details comes through. If that's the role that you're leading and that's the state that you've got to be in, and the fly on the wall is not able to make out who's finance and who's business, I would say that you're a good finance business partner.
Very interesting, Raghav. Again, how does one grow in their finance career to become a CFO?
I get this question quite often from youngsters who say, my ambition is to be a CFO. How long will it take me to be a CFO? Assuming that you're starting your professional journey probably in your early 20s, I would say give it somewhere between 15 to 25 years, which is a fairly long period of time to become a CFO of a decently large company. I believe through my experience and what I have observed for people around me, the journey to become a CFO, you can probably think of it as being in two phases. The first phase and the second phase. The first phase I would call, to keep it simple, probably the execution phase. And this is a phase where I think three things happen, and they happen really well. The first is the finance person at the early stages of his or her career learns to serve a customer, or perhaps serve and partner with somebody who's in turn serving a customer. I think getting this right is absolutely important so that you understand how your actions are leading to customer delight. Second, you basically govern a team through a set of metrics, and these metrics are both financial as well as non-financial metrics. And you learn in course of this experience that these metrics often conflict with one another. You may be responsible for a budget, but at the same time, you are responsible, or you partner with somebody who's responsible for the top line, which consumes the budget, and therefore there is pressure on the budget. So governing the team by managing some of these metrics, which may conflict both financial as well as non-financial with each other, and discovering harmony on them is the second part that you learn in the first phase. The third, and pretty important, are people skills. When you're young, you need to know how to lead You also need to know how to be led, and the latter is often as important as the former. You learn interpersonal skills, and you often learn the softer parts of what it means to lead a person or to lead a team, which may have individuals who are older than yourself. And I think that's very important. The second phase is where you start interacting with strategy quite a bit. I think this is a phase where you shadow or observe at close quarters senior leaders in the organization. You learn from them, both from the good things that they do as well as the mistakes that they make. And you often pick up their personal characteristics and productivity habits that make them successful. Equally, you become aware of some of the defects that they might have. The second part in phase two is the intimate awareness of how strategy actually works on the ground, and more importantly, deployment of strategy or perhaps a change in strategy. That's where you learn how strategy interacts with structure, how strategy interacts with culture of an organization. And then, of course, strategies roll out through execution that hopefully you would have learned in the first phase of your career. You also learn how to manage conflict between different lines of the P&L, and sometimes manage the conflict that is there between the P&L and the balance sheet itself. And that's very important as you become senior and head towards a CFO. And of course, very importantly, in the second phase, you learn through experience of how to exert your influence beyond direct authority. And that's very important if you have to become a CFO. So I visualize the CFO journey as being constructed of these two phases, probably about 7 to 10 or 7 to 12 years each. And some parts of it may, of course, work concurrently and in parallel. And at the end of it, I think you're probably ready to be a CFO is the way I would look at it.
In all our conversations, there were many concepts that came through. And one of the other concepts that we really loved was the PCM approach towards successful mergers and acquisition. Can you talk about that a bit?
So one of my stints before joining Amazon was as responsible for mergers and acquisitions. And this is something that I heard from an investment banker. And I found it to be quite apt and quite true and very simple tip. He said, just like you have physics, chemistry, and maths when you're a student, for a successful M&A to work, physics, chemistry, and maths are important. And by the way, in M&As, as we know, out of 10 proposals, only one gets approved. And out of maybe 10 proposals that get approved and executed, only a few are deemed successful. So the physics part of it is, are you clear about the structure and about the asset? And how is it going to fit into your business model? So it's the physics of the transaction. And maybe it is to do with how you're going to structure the entire transaction and how the pieces will come together and work. That's a physics part of it. The chemistry, and sometimes this gets ignored, but I think the Indian promoters do a very good job of it, is there good chemistry between the key decision makers on both sides? Both parties have to really trust each other, and the chemistry between them has to be really good for the transaction to go through. So that's a chemistry part of it. The math is, of course, the cost and the value of the deal as seen and perceived by both the parties. They should be clear about how value is being created, and they should come to an agreement on the math of the cost to be paid for the transaction. So only if this physics, chemistry, and math comes true does a successful M&A take place.
How is working in a data-rich and a digital company different from traditional analog or brick-and-mortar company?
I think I'll start with a quote that I've personally used quite often, and I've lived through that quote. Information is the new oil of the 21st century is something that all of us have heard. But I think the critical part is the second part of the quote, that information may be the new oil, but analytics is the combustion engine. I think in digital companies, the capability around analytics, basically the capability around building a better combustion engine is really important. All of us are swimming in data. Data will virtually become like a commodity. But a company which has a better analytics and a better combustion engine to use that data is what makes it a truly good digital company. Now, coming back to what I would call analog companies, the finance team usually focuses on transactions. Let's say you're probably manufacturing soap. You create value for your organization by making sure the difference between the revenue that you get when you sell each bar of soap and the cost that you incur for manufacturing that bar of soap multiplied by the thousands or millions of transactions that take place is a value that you create. And therefore, your focus is really on the transaction of it. How can I increase my revenue? And how can I reduce my costs? and how can I maximize my volume so that the composite value is created. Now that's great, but it often leads you to focus on the current period, the current quarter or so. In digital companies, because of the analytics and the combustion engine I mentioned earlier, you're in a position to use today's data and historical data to be able to predict what is going to happen in the future, which also means that the decision making in your organization, especially what finance is involved in, you should actually be maximizing for the net present value of future cash flows, because you now have the ability to predict through current actions what is going to happen in the future. I sort of call that focus on sort of cash flows or downstream impact. And that is something that digital companies are increasingly building a muscle towards. And I think that's one of the most important differences between companies that think digitally from a finance lens and companies that think analog, like an analog company from a finance lens.
I think the next question is going to be interesting for many. How do you hire at Amazon?
So that's a good question. And we do spend a lot of time and energy and bandwidth on hiring people. First, I think functional competence is obviously important. It goes without saying, but think of it as a hygiene layer. The candidate would not get to the interview table if we felt that he or she did not have the right degree of functional expertise to be considered for the role. But I think once this is ascertained, where we spend a lot of our time and energy is ascertaining the culture fit of the organization, of the person with the organization. So we look at the candidate past record and assess whether the candidate is compatible with the culture of Amazon. And we assess this through fitment with our leadership principles. And specifically for finance, whether the person has demonstrated a track record of earning trust with his or her business partners, has a person demonstrated backbone to be able to put forward a point of view which may be completely independent? Does a person have the ability to roll up his or her sleeves and get into details? Has a person invented or brought about continuous improvement? And does a person have, for example, a track record in turn of hiring good people and developing and coaching and building a strong team? And if the answer to all of this is yes, then we also ask ourselves, is this person better than 50% of the people that we have at the same level? And we also ask ourselves, do we think this person can go to the next level? And if the answer to all of it is yes, we go ahead and hopefully make the offer to the candidate.
What is your advice to a young professional?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think my advice to young people who are probably starting their career and let's say they're in their early 20s is absolutely work hard, work smart, work long, and do all three of them. Build the capability for working hard, working smart, and working long. You may not need it for your entire 20 or 30 years of your career, but build that capability. That's point number one. Second, and I believe this, keep yourself physically fit. I think that's very important. Many of us underestimate the importance of keeping yourself physically fit when you're young, but that's something that I think is absolutely important. Third, my advice would be to build strong social networks around you through relationships, both maybe at work and outside of work. It could be your spouse, it could be your family, it could be your relatives, it could be your friends. But it's very important for a person to build social networks around themselves. And I think it's really important to build a spiritual or a moral compass. Have a sense of what is right and wrong, of the things that are happening around you, and make that a part of what your inner self is. And of course, throughout your life, stay humble, keep learning. You will never get to a phase where you think the learning is done. So these are the pieces of advice that I would give to young people who are starting their finance career.
Thank you so much, Raghavan, and thank you viewers for watching.